An enormously consequential decision for the 2024 election by the Supreme Court could come as soon as today. The justices expected to decide on the future of Donald Trump's candidacy for president. He remains the current Republican frontrunner. Trump on Wednesday appealed the decision from Colorado's Supreme Court to take his name off the Republican primary ballot there. The nation's highest court has never before issued a ruling on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And whatever the justices decide to apply to Colorado will apply to all other states. That includes Maine, where his name has also been barred from the ballot. That decision also remains on pause pending a decision on Trump's appeal there. Just yesterday, petitions were filed in 2 more states, Massachusetts and Illinois, to take Trump's name off the ballot there. And the list of states could continue to grow until the Supreme Court weighs in. And while those close to the president say he is concerned that the Supreme Court might ultimately rule against him, his attorney, Alina Habba, says he has nothing to worry about. Here she is on Fox News.
I think it should be a slam dunk in the Supreme Court. I have faith in them. You know, people like Kavanaugh, who the president fought for, who the president went through hell to get into place. He'll step up.
Joining our conversation, former top official at the Department of Justice, Andrew Weissmann. Ian and the Rev are also back with us. Andrew Weissmann, what do you expect to happen here?
Well, I can tell you 2 things that I'm going to be looking for. I think the most important thing is obviously, whether they take the case or not. But I think, everyone thinks that they will take the case. I think they pretty much have to, even if I think they probably privately wish this wasn't landing on their plate. But I think the main issue for people to be thinking about is what do they set as the schedule? How fast are they going to require briefing? When will they hear this? As you noted, Alicia, there is a stay in the Colorado case. There are ballots that need to go out in Colorado and obviously many other states. And so I'm going to look for how quickly are they going to decide this. The second thing is, are they going to give any hint in granting cert, in other words, accepting the case? They very often say these are the issues presented, or are they just going to give a sort of general grant that says, we're going to review the legality of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision? That's not typical. It could happen here, but they may give some clues as to what they're focusing on by how they grant cert in this case.
All right. So, Ian, that is what we're watching for from the court. Let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump and his team. We often talk about the ways in which he operates like a mob boss, the way that he sends messages, perhaps not directly, but through surrogates. The fact that you have Alina Habba showing up on Fox one day saying he's worried that this court is not going to rule in his favor, and then showing up another day and saying that they expect justices like Justice Kavanaugh to, quote, step up. I mean, the subtext seems pretty clear.
Well, it's remarkably poor strategy. They're used to bullying elected officials who need to run for office in Republican primaries and depend on Trump's blessing. But of course, the justices of the Supreme Court have life tenure. And what they want to establish is that they're independent. So I think that strategy of trying to pressure, bully, or intimidate Justice Kavanaugh is likely to backfire. But while I want to endorse all of the always wise things that Andrew said, I also want to make sure that we don't lose the forest for the trees here, which is that whatever the court does, in the details or on the merits, let's just take stock of the fact that we are actually having a national debate about whether one of the likely nominees of a major party for the presidency engaged in insurrection against the United States and is therefore not qualified for running. Regardless of the law, shouldn't that just be politically disqualifying for either party? Don't both parties want people for whom there's not a question as to whether they engaged in insurrection against our country?
I know you ask it as a rhetorical question. I feel like we could spend 15 minutes here answering it. Rev, to the point about not losing the stakes here, not losing the context, I want to read you just a little bit of something Jamelle Bouie wrote in the New York Times. What unites Trump with the former secessionists under the disqualification clause is that, like them, he refused to listen to the voice of the voting public. He rejected the bedrock principle of democratic life, the peaceful transfer of power. The unspoken assumption behind the idea that Trump should be allowed on the ballot and that the public should have the chance to choose for or against him yet again is that he will respect the voice of the electorate. But we know this isn't true. It wasn't true after the 2016 presidential election, when after winning the Electoral College, he sought to delegitimize the popular vote victory of his opponent as fraud, and it was put into stark relief after the 2020 presidential election. There is an irony here. He is saying the Democratic thing to do is to allow me to be on the ballot, allow me to be on the ballot in the name of democracy. This coming from a person who tried to overturn a fair and free election.
And I think that is the point. I think that is what needs to be recognized here. And that is that if we give legitimacy to someone that wanted to overthrow the process in the name of the process, then we're playing into the continuation of this kind of chicanery. I mean, like you had in the last part, when you have a lawyer, I mean, I don't know where you get a lawyer that sits there and says, he fought for you, therefore you ought to do him a favor. Not that the law should give him something, but it's like gangsters. Mm-hmm. You remember me, Joey, from the neighborhood. I mean, what are we talking about if we are going to allow this kind of behavior to become normalized in the body politic? And I think that's what he's saying there, is that we can't normalize this, even though some people feel it's only going to galvanize Trump's base. But what about the regard for law and Constitution in this country?
Let's talk about law, Constitution, and norms, Andrew Weissmann, because yesterday a group of House Democrats called on Clarence Thomas to recuse from this case. Here's what they write in part, quote, "This time we must urge you to recuse yourself from any involvement in the case of Anderson versus Griswold, because your impartiality is reasonably questioned by substantial numbers of fair-minded members of the public who believe your wife, Virginia Ginny Thomas's substantial involvement in the events leading up to the January 6th insurrection and the financial incentive it presents for your household if President Trump is reelected are disqualifying." Any chance he recuses?
None. In a word. I think that what we're unfortunately seeing in the Supreme Court justices is an example of might makes right, which is sort of, to Ian's point, truly shocking because it's coming from members of the highest court of the land, meaning, you know what, I'm going to thumb my nose at sort of norms and rules that every other member of the Article 3 judiciary follows. And I would note that the thing that I find sort of most troubling is that we still to this day have such a real lack of information. For instance, there has been discussion about whether Justice Thomas has appropriately reported to the IRS all of the gifts and the income, or whether he faces liability for that, civil or even criminal. I'm not saying he does, but there's just a complete lack of information. That would obviously be something that would be important in viewing, his incentives in terms of whether he wants to see this administration an order administration, or whether he wants to see President Trump reinstalled as the president. There's just a real lack of information from the Supreme Court on all of these issues that should be transparent in a democracy. But again, there's just no sort of accountability. And I feel like this is sort of the moment in our times where you don't have that from former President Trump. You don't have it from the people in the Supreme Court. You don't have it from Republicans or certain Republicans in Congress. And no sense from the electorate that this is something that is completely intolerable to have in a democracy where these people are public officials who work for us, not the other way around.